Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are wrestling with, one of the biggest questions in 20th century history. Who is really to blame for the Cold War?
It's the ultimate debate, isn't it?
Right.
And for you, especially if you're tackling the IGCSE curriculum, the secret isn't picking a side.
No.
The secret is knowing the evidence for every side. And that's our mission today. We're going to unpack the three main historical interpretations.
Exactly. We're giving you the toolkit for that perfect balanced argument. So let's frame it up. First, there's the traditional or orthodox view.
Which points the finger directly at the Soviet Union.
Then you have the revisionist school.
And they flip it completely,
Yeah.
arguing that the USA and the West were the ones escalating things.
And finally, the post-revisionist view, which kind of suggests everyone was to blame, or maybe no one was. It's more about the situation they were in.
Right, that it was almost inevitable.
Okay, let's start with the one that dominated Western thinking for so long.
The orthodox view.
Okay, so let's unpack this orthodox view. If you're arguing that the Soviet Union is to blame, what's your core evidence? What's the argument?
Well, the reason we call it orthodox is because for decades, this was the accepted story in the West.
Right.
The core argument is that Stalin's actions right after World War II were just fundamentally aggressive and expansionist.
So what are we talking about specifically? What did he do?
The biggest piece of evidence is the Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe. The Red Army defeated the Nazis, and then they just stayed.
They didn't go home.
They did not. And one by one, Stalin installed loyal communist governments in Poland, Hungary, Romania, all across the region. These became the satellite states.
And this was seen as a direct violation of the agreements at Yalta, wasn't it? The promise of free elections.
Completely. That promise was, basically thrown out the window. Elections were rigged, non-communist leaders were intimidated or removed.
So from the West's perspective, this wasn't about security. This looked like building an empire.
It looked exactly like that, a buffer zone that was under total Soviet control.
Okay, so that's the slow creep of control across Eastern Europe. But what about a single, really blatant act of aggression?
Oh, that would have to be the Berlin blockade in
Right.
48.
Right.
I mean, Stalin literally tried to starve 2 million people in West Berlin by cutting off all road and rail access.
It was a siege?
It was absolutely a siege, a clear, unambiguous attempt to force the Western Allies out and take the whole city.
And the West's response, the Berlin airlift, just highlights how aggressive Stalin's move really was.
It does. And beyond just military force, Stalin was also building these tools of control. You had Cominform in 1947.
Okay, let's pause on that. Cominform. What was that, and why is it evidence?
Cominform was essentially an organization to make sure all the communist parties in Europe followed Moscow's exact orders.
So no independent thought.
None. If you tried to be your own kind of communist, like Tito in Yugoslavia, you were condemned. Then you had Comintern in 1949.
The economic version.
Exactly. It was the Soviet response to Western money, tying all the Eastern European economies directly to the USSR. So the orthodox conclusion is pretty clear.
Stalin wasn't interested in cooperation.
He was interested in domination.
Okay, that is a very, very strong case for Soviet aggression. But, and this is where it gets so fascinating for historians, the revisionist view completely flips the script.
It does. This view really took hold in the 60s and 70s when people in the U.S. started questioning their own government's motives, because of Vietnam.
So historians started looking back and asking, hang on, were we really just reacting or were we provoking them?
Exactly. And revisionists point to one thing, right at the end of the war, that created immediate distrust.
The atomic bomb.
Atomic bomb. The U.S. develops this city-destroying weapon in secret and uses it without telling their supposed ally, Stalin, anything about it.
That's not what allies do.
Not at all. Revisionists see that as atomic diplomacy, a move to intimidate Moscow and show them who was really in charge now.
And you can see how that would just breed instant suspicion.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Stalin realized he was dealing with a power that had this incredible weapon and was willing to use it unilaterally. But then, 2 years later, it gets official.
The Truman Doctrine, 1947.
Right. The U.S. basically announces it will support any country fighting against communism.
Which, to the Soviets, must have sounded like a declaration of war.
It was. They saw it as the U.S. setting itself up as a global policeman, ready to interfere in any country's internal affairs to stop communism. It was a massive confrontational shift.
And that policy was immediately backed up with money. A lot of money.
The Marshall Plan.
Mhm.
Billions of dollars to rebuild Europe.
Which sounds humanitarian.
It was marketed that way. But the catch was, you only got the money if you opened up your economy and accepted U.S. influence.
Ah.
The Soviets called it dollar imperialism, and honestly, they weren't wrong.
So what does dollar imperialism mean for, the student trying to explain this?
It means the U.S. was using its economic power to buy loyalty and create a Western-aligned bloc in Europe. It was drawing a line down the continent with dollars.
Before any military lines were drawn.
Precisely. And the final piece of the puzzle, the military one, comes in 1949,
NATO.
the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a formal military alliance of the West. From Moscow's perspective, they were now being surrounded by a hostile military force.
And the revisionists would argue, look at Russia's history. Invaded by Napoleon, invaded in World War I, invaded by Hitler.
Of course they wanted a buffer zone. The argument is that the U.S. saw purely defensive moves through a lens of aggression and overreacted, escalating the whole thing.
So we have aggressive Soviets and provocative Americans. It feels like we're at an impasse.
And that's exactly where the post-revisionist school of thought comes in. They look at this and say, maybe you're asking the wrong question.
It's not about who to blame.
It's less about individual blame and more about the system, the situation itself. They argue that this conflict was almost structurally unavoidable.
Okay, what's the foundation of that argument?
The absolute, undeniable clash of ideologies.
Capitalism versus communism?
Exactly. One champions individual freedom and free markets, the other state control and a single party. They are fundamentally incompatible systems.
And both sides truly believed their way of life was threatened by the other.
Genuinely.
Yeah.
So there was always going to be friction, no matter who's in charge. It wasn't just about Stalin and Truman.
And that ideological clash was fueled by a huge amount of just misunderstanding.
And mistrust. Deep, deep mistrust. You have Stalin, who was famously paranoid, and Truman, who was new to foreign policy and tended to see things in very black and white terms.
So they were always assuming the absolute worst about each other.
Constantly. And that poor communication just poured gasoline on the fire, which leads to the next key point for post-revisionists, the reactive policies.
The tit-for-tat escalation.
Yes, this is the core of it. You can just trace the chain reaction. The U.S. announces the Marshall Plan.
So the Soviets have to respond with CumCon?
The West creates NATO.
So eventually the Soviets create the Warsaw Pact.
Each move was a reaction to the last. It wasn't necessarily one side with a grand plan for conquest. It was more like a geopolitical chain reaction,
Yeah.
where neither side felt they could afford not to respond.
And this was all happening in a very specific context, right? The power vacuum in Europe after the war.
That's the final piece. Europe was destroyed.
Yeah.
Germany, the traditional power in the center, was in ruins. So you have this huge vacuum.
And two new superpowers rushing in to fill it.
Exactly. The U.S. and the USSR both rushed to spread their influence and ideology into that empty space. It was the competition for that unstable territory, more than just pure malice, that really sparked the conflict.
Wow, okay, that synthesis that's incredibly helpful. So let's bring this right back to the learner. You're in an exam hall, you get that 10-mark question. Who is more to blame for the Cold War, the USA or the USSR? Explain your answer.
Right. This is your blueprint. The absolute number one thing to remember is that the examiner is not looking for the right answer.
There isn't one.
There isn't one. They're looking for a supported judgment. That means using evidence for both sides of the argument. Balance is everything.
So you can't just argue for one side.
Absolutely not. You need at least, I would say, 4 paragraphs before your conclusion. 2 arguing the case against the USA, and 2 arguing the case against the USSR. And use that PEE structure.
Point, evidence, explanation.
Always.
Okay, let's walk through it. Let's start with the paragraph blaming the USA. What's our point?
Our point could be that the U.S. created an atmosphere of aggression through its policy of dollar imperialism.
Okay, and the evidence.
Marshall Plan. And your explanation connects it. You explain that by offering aid with strings attached, the U.S. was deliberately splitting Europe into economic camps, forcing Stalin's hand to create his own bloc with CumCon. It makes the U.S. look like the provocateur.
That's a great, solid paragraph. Now, crucially, we have to pivot. The next paragraph has to argue the other side.
And use a clear transition.
However,
However, it could be argued the USSR bears the primary blame because its actions were overtly aggressive, not just defensive.
and for that point, what evidence would we use?
The Berlin blockade. It's perfect.
Because the explanation is so clear.
It is. You explain that blockading West Berlin wasn't a defensive move. It was an aggressive gamble to seize territory that put millions of civilians at risk. It proves Stalin was willing to risk war for expansion.
So now we have 2 strong points for each side using different evidence. We get to the conclusion. How do we avoid just saying they were both to blame?
You have to make a final judgment, but you use careful, nuanced language. You avoid saying equally. Instead, you weigh the
That
evidence.
says something like,
You could say, while the USA was partially responsible for escalating tensions through its economic policies and atomic secrecy, the USSR bears the greater responsibility.
due to its direct military aggression in the Berlin blockade and the systematic takeover of Eastern Europe, which went far beyond legitimate security concerns.
Exactly. You've weighed the evidence. You've shown that you see territorial conquest as more directly aggressive than economic influence. That is a sophisticated, high-level conclusion.
It's not about finding a villain, it's about proportioning the blame based on the evidence.
That's the secret.
So, to sum up this deep dive, the Cold War wasn't started by a single event.
Not at all. It was a complex storm of clashing ideologies, deep-seated mistrust, and a series of reactive moves that just kept escalating.
A structural confrontation playing out in the power vacuum of post-war Europe. And we focus today on the causes, the blame game, which explains why these policies of containment began.
But for the learner, that's only the first step. The next question is about the consequences.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to take away, one that comes directly from the sources. Once this division of Europe was set in stone, how secure was the USSR's control over Eastern Europe, really?
Between 1948 and, say, 1989, did those tools of control like CONCON and the Warsaw Pact actually work? Or did the way the conflict started plant the seeds of future rebellion right from the beginning?
So use these three interpretations, orthodox, revisionist, post-revisionist, as your toolkit.
They're the blueprint for any great essay on the Cold War.
Go build that supported judgment. We'll see you next time on the Deep Dive.